Good evening. Mark Schaffler, Director of Water Utilities. Excited to be here this evening actually to present the first ever strategic plan that's been developed for our Water Utilities Department. I'm joined here this evening with several folks, Bruce Haddock with Bartlett West, Pat Young with HDR, Jeff McGarvey with HDR, several employees who've been involved in the process here to show their interest and support in the plan itself. And probably most importantly, several community members who, without their time and effort, this project would have never got completed. Hopefully, by the end of the evening, you will agree that the plan sets a good course for the future of the utility systems that served our community for several decades and does a good job of describing those action steps and where we need to go. So with that, introduce Bruce Haddock with Bartlett West.
Well, thank you, Mark. Let me make sure I'm operating this correctly. Okay, very good. As Mark described, there's been a lot of effort that's gone into this, and we've been working on this for about the past 18 months. The last contact you had with this was to hear about the assessment report back in March. So walking through our agenda for the evening, we'll be kind of refreshing what was discussed in that assessment document and how that came about. We'll speak to what the makeup of the community advisory group was and have some participation from them this evening, and then get into the recommendations that came out of the strategic plan itself. So going back to the assessment and what all went into that, again, a great deal of effort to consider past reports and studies that have been done for the utility. A lot of just pouring through their documents, information about how they're organized, the finances, the operational statistics, a lot of data to look at. Spent some time interviewing most of the council to hear their perspectives and what their thoughts were about the utility, where they thought there could be some improvements. Of course, we had the community advisory group, and we'll speak in a little more detail to who was involved in that. And there are several folks here this evening we'd like to recognize at some point. We also conducted last fall a survey across the entire community, really asking about the utility and perceptions and a lot of information about how folks experience their interaction with the utility. Contacts with the Lease Summit 360 folks, interviews with the employees of the utility, and interviews and contacts with other leaders in the community through the Economic Development Council, Lease Summit Social Services, some of those kinds of entities. A little more detail on the Community Advisory Group, and if you'll recall, this was a group that the Council participated in making recommendations to who to include in this. And it included the perspectives of residential customers both inside the city and outside the city, because there are customers outside the city that are customers of the utility. Commercial users, both large and smaller water users. The development community was represented. And then other community organizations like the Economic Development Council, Lease Summit 360, and the Planning Commission were also participants in the group. And with that, I'd like to take just a moment and ask the folks here tonight who were on the Community Advisory Group to stand up and just let you all know that they're here tonight. So if you would please, those of you that participated. Okay, thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Bill, and we'll move on through the presentation. And Bill Marco will step up next. He was one of the members of the Community Advisory Group.
Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate this time here. As a member of the advisory group, I'm just the spokesman for tonight. Another meeting, you might have another spokesman. I think I was closest to the microphone tonight. But essentially, I think what our objective here was to really give a voice of the community to this process, to represent the families, the businesses, the constituents around what this plan should look like. I know we couldn't get everybody in the room, but there were approximately 20 of us that attended for, as Bruce indicated, 12 to 18 months. And they were a dedicated group because water and sewer for 12 to 18 months is quite the obligation. And I think what we would say is there's a wide range of skill set there. We had some very technical people who are experienced with dealing with the city and the utility. And then we had more, I would say, less technical people like myself, where H means hot, C means cold, and the motion sensor is something I can't quite get right usually. But in general, what we ended up focusing on was what was most important to the vast majority of the citizens. What did we want to see in this report? And what you see on that screen there is really financial viability and infrastructure stability. We really focused in on those two areas because it affects everybody. Not that the other categories are not important. In fact, there are elements of the strategic plan that address each and every one of those things. But we had to make sure what we saw in the end report represented where we thought the biggest pain was, and maybe more so what the biggest risk was in the future. You can see from many of the surveys, including the surveys in this report, that there's widespread satisfaction with the utility. But that's based on previous experience. We're trying to take a look ahead. We had access to data that the average member of the community didn't have. And really what we see is some big concerns in these two areas. So we're pleased to say, after looking at the final report, participating in it, challenging the water utility, them challenging us, that we can see our comments, our ideas, our concept baked into this report. I think it's a challenging report. It's pragmatic. It's smart for our consumers. It's smart for businesses. I think it's sensitive to some of the fixed income community. I think in general, it sets us apart as a community that's willing to to face some challenges that are ahead and face them proactively versus reactively. Thank you. I'll pass this over to Pat now.
I want to start by expanding upon what Bill talked about. The two key features that they saw in the assessment report were the need to look at the infrastructure stability and the financial viability. Some of these slides you'll remember are from the presentation last spring. What we see from the infrastructure side of it is there is a backlog of repair and replacement projects out there. There are a number of failing water lines within the utility itself. In fact, there have been about 190 failures within the last 12 months, 145 or so of those from July to present. Certainly some of those are made worse, or those are really exposed when you hit the dry weather that we had. Any of those weak points go ahead and fail as the soil pulls away from the pipe and it gets as dry as it has been. But we don't want to see the sites like you see in the lower picture there, where you're trying to drive down Douglas Road and you have a geyser coming out in the middle of Douglas Road. Certainly we've been in front of you in the past, in front of the council, talking about infiltration inflow, rainwater getting within the sewer system itself. That is really a piece of the failing sewer lines, and I'll expand upon that in a minute. And then the other thing that came out through the assessment was really the utility operates inefficiently from a service facility perspective. They currently operate out of 5 different facilities. All of their operations come out of 5 different facilities. In fact, the picture that you see there for you used to be an old water holding reservoir that the utility utilized, and it's now having to be used as a material storage. So you can imagine basically an underground reservoir being used to store all of the material, and what it takes, the staff to get materials basically in and out of that type facility. Just to talk about where some of those water main failures have occurred, we've got a map that actually shows the last 5 years worth of breaks, and you'll see certainly the ones that are within inside the city, and then over on the east side you see the ones that the utility, actually the system that they maintain, that's outside of city limits itself. And you'll see clusters or areas where the sewer mains are put in corrosive soil conditions or weren't installed and bedded properly, and you start to see clusters of these mains basically failing, and then the utility having to come in and make repairs and ultimately needing to replace those facilities. Likewise, on the sewer side, the map that you see in front of you, there are a number of small lines. Most of those lines actually represent the sewers within the utility owns and operates. The ones that are highlighted in red are actually made of clay tile pipe. Clay pipe was used pretty extensively up through, I'd say, the 70s and even into the early 80s. And when you start to overlay where the utility's having problems, 18 months worth of defects that have been uncovered, you see the majority of those defects actually occurring within that clay tile pipe, within the older areas of town. In fact, the picture that you see is looking up a pipe, and you see where joints are offset, and the pipe is actually cracked and failing and starting to cave in. And those are the type of defects that you actually see within the older areas of town that have that clay tile pipe that I talked about. In fact, just this week, there's an area near Market in Maine where a plumber was trying to tie in a new service lateral for a building, and that's what you see as the lower pipe. The condition of the clay tile pipe, which is there kind of in the lower middle part of the picture, is actually so poor that the connection could not be made. Every time you try to make the connection, the clay tile pipe would just crumble. You see 5 pictures on your right where the utility went in and televised the main, and there's about 700 feet of the clay tile pipe that is just deteriorated to the point where it needs completely replaced. To give you an idea, if that clay tile pipe had been rehabilitated by lining it before it got to this condition, that 700 feet would have cost you about $16,000 to line and basically renew the system. The cost of this repair, the estimate just came in today at $130,000 to replace versus renewing it. So, the message there is if the clay tile pipe is ignored long enough, it costs you much more to repair and replace it than it does to renew your system as you move along. The other area of the assessment moved into the financial viability side of things. And what we saw when we looked at the utility, especially on the water side, is the revenues at this point are just simply insufficient to keep up with the water supply cost. The utility has to go out and purchase water from the cities of Kansas City and Independence. Those supply costs have been going up, increasing significantly. So at this point, revenues are not sufficient to cover those costs, along with the operating costs the utility has, and those short and long-term capital needs, the replacement of the failing water mains. Sewer side, the picture is not quite as bleak. You've got some sufficient revenues today, but you're facing increased cost of treatment. Like the water side, all wastewater generated within the utility itself are actually treated by the Little Blue Valley Sewer District and Middle Big Creek District, so you pay for that cost of treatment. Those costs are also going up. And then certainly we looked at some of those areas of clay tile pipe and some of the areas that need to be addressed with long-term improvements. To give you an idea of the order of magnitude of some of the costs that are really beyond the utility's control, the first that we see are that cost of that wastewater treatment. And what you're looking at there, the cost of, in 2010, for a typical 5,000-gallon residential user, of their bill, $13.91 would be that cost of treatment that the utility pays out. By 2020, that's projected to be almost $25.50. So some pretty significant increases, and these are largely due to improvements that those two wholesale treatment providers, improvements that they're doing. Those costs are being passed on to you in proportion to how much wastewater you in essence have treated. I talked about the water supply costs, and they've changed pretty dramatically. Here it's even complicated because you have 2 suppliers. The blue line at the top is the city of Kansas City. Obviously, cost you more per 1,000 gallons from Kansas City than it does from Independence. But both of the costs have been going up. And what the utility does, they buy as much water contractually as they can buy from Independence at the lower cost, and then they buy the remaining amount from the city of Kansas City. And again, what you've seen here from 2005 to present, some pretty significant increases. And then both of those providers of water are projecting increases moving forward. And we basically laid in those increases. The couple points or 3 points that you see where the cost either went down or the increase wasn't that large, where the black dots are, that's where your utility went back to the cities of Kansas City and Independence and looked at contractually how much could they raise your rates, reviewed the cost of service studies that those entities had done, and questioned and actually did a good job of either holding costs down or in a couple cases actually reducing the cost that you were paying for water. If you look especially on the water side at that impact of where that side of it sits from a revenue perspective, moving forward from 2012 out to 2016, you'll see that with those increases in the cost of paying for that water and some other operational costs, reserves in essence will be depleted by the end of 2012. There's a modest level of capital improvements, about $4 million planned over that period of time. But by the time you get to the end of 2016, the shortfall or the deficit in revenue would be over $8 million. So even if you did no capital improvements, that side of the utility would be sitting over $4 million, basically in the hole and a deficit if nothing is done moving forward. And as we worked with the community advisory group, at the end of the assessment report, the message that we heard is there is a need to restore those reserves. The utility needs to operate with a sufficient amount of reserves. Certainly the failing water lines, sewer lines are an issue. They need to be addressed. Infiltration and inflow, rainwater getting in the sewer system needs to be removed out. There is a need to consolidate operations into facility. They certainly recognize, as those recommendations are being made, that you can't do that without revenue. So their message back was, let's make sure that those future rate increases are kept in check at something that's affordable to the consumers, is in line with other communities. And the number that was being discussed with the community advisory group was in the neighborhood of 5 to 6% per year, and that kind of set the stage for some of the recommendations that actually occur within the strategic plan itself. So I'll kind of move from the assessment to the strategic plan. I know that you all have copies of the strategic plan. It really works in 4 areas. 2 of the areas I'm just going to hit upon here, and the other 2, the ones that have been deemed the most important, the operations or infrastructure stability and financial viability, I'll go in more detail on. But the areas outside that included customer relations. There are quite a few initiatives within the strategic plan that go in and recommend additional customer education. Ways to minimize risk to those customers. One example of that would be each customer owns their lateral from their house out to the sewer main itself. If that lateral fails, customer is responsible for repairing that lateral. There are insurance programs out there that the customers can buy and pay $5 a month instead of having a $7,500 repair bill. They can get reimbursed for those costs. So there are items like customer education within the customer relations category. Human relations is additional training for staff, keeping the utility as knowledgeable as they are or advancing their knowledge within there, dealing with items like succession planning in the future. So those aren't going to be hit as heavy as we move forward, so I wanted to hit those 2 items here. From the operations or the infrastructure stability side, there's about $59 million worth of backlog of projects that currently are unplanned for. The lion's share of those improvements show up in water system improvements and sewer system improvements. There are some dollars within there to look at consolidating operations itself. And then there's also money in there for meter replacement. This town saw a lot of growth in the 80s. All of those meters are becoming of age. They need replaced. The utility needs to know how much water is being sold and accurately meter that to the customers. So there is a meter replacement program within there. If you look on the water side, what you see are the red lines show some of the backlog of projects that would be funded through the strategic plan itself, or if the recommendations are implemented. A lot of those red lines were in those clusters of those main failures that you saw happening, where you've got a lot of failures close together, and it goes in and renews those assets, so you cut down the frequency of the failures of the water main. Likewise, on the sewer side, the lion's share of the recommendations are in the high I&I removal areas, which are the areas shaded in black. These are the area where the majority of the rainwater gets into the city system. And then you'll notice that the majority of those areas just lay over the top of those clay tile pipe. It's also funds to go in and renew a portion of the clay tile pipe. So the worst 20% or the oldest or worst condition pipes out there would be renewed. So now you're proactively renewing those pipes instead of waiting for the complete failure and the very costly failures of the system. With that, I'll let Jeff talk about the financial piece of the strategic plan.
Thank you, sir. Briefly, as you know, we were, as part of this effort, we were retained to do a financial review of the system. And essentially, when we approach these kind of projects, the first step is always to create a base case or a do-nothing scenario. This is essentially a scenario that is an extension of the status quo. It assumes no strategic initiatives, no rate increases, no adjusted capital program. It assumes a kind of sort of a linear escalation of O&M costs. And it creates, again, the base case. If we did nothing and we just continued operations from a status quo basis, this is what we'd look like over the next 5 years. And the result of that review indicated that really the do-nothing option is not a good one. It's not a good one for the water and sewer utilities. As Pat mentioned, the water utility is expected to operate at a loss, and that is not including any of the strategic initiatives. The sewer system, as Pat indicated also, is expected to generate a little bit of net positive operating income, but again, this is without strategic initiatives and also without addressing the accumulated backlog and renewable replacement requirements. So what happens with a do-nothing scenario is your reserves are fully depleted, as the one graph showed. There is not sufficient or adequate funds available to you to maintain or reinvest in the system, and that the rates and revenues are not sufficient to keep pace with the increasing anticipated increases in wholesale water and wastewater treatment costs. One of the recommendations that came out of this endeavor was to create a water utility advisory committee, and this is essentially an expansion of your existing water tap committee that you already have. And this committee is tasked with reviewing water capital projects and attaching those to a water tap fee. The recommendation is that you add sewer to that and make sure that the sewer tap fees are considered with the same approach and same diligence that the water tap fees are. One of the other recommendations for this committee would be that it is a representative group of your customer base. In other words, it's going to include some folks from the inside and outside city service territories, as well as your commercial and other customer groups, to make sure you've got the right cross-section of folks having input into this committee. And at the end of the day, the goal of this committee is to periodically review certain operational and financial information and provide observations, recommendations back to council as to whether or not the tap fees, for instance, and the rates and charges, other rates, fees, and charges of the community or the utility are achieving what you'd like them to achieve, that they're achieving the goals and objectives you've set forth for your rates and charges. One of the other recommendations was to adopt certain financial and rate management policies, and we don't have them all listed up here today, or this evening. But for example, the minimum operating reserve funds. This 90-day targeted minimum reserve balance is industry standard. It's widely used by utilities across the country, and this essentially is saying that I will keep, as a utility, on hand 90 days of O&M at any given time to make sure that I can weather ups and downs in revenues or certain emergencies that may pop up, and I've got cash on hand to deal with those. There's other ones we have listed here: the revenue to expense ratio, the debt service ratio less than 20%. This is saying that I will, as a utility, I will try to endeavor to not borrow beyond a certain point, that my assets are not too heavily leveraged as a utility. One of the other recommendations was to create a rate policy that requires a cost of service be done periodically, and this periodically, this word it's really up to you. We see the gamut of things out there in the utility industry, and if everybody does something different. It could be every other year, it could be every third year, that's up to you, but our recommendation would be that it is a periodic rate study where you bring in a third-party recognized rate expert to help you evaluate your rates and make sure that they're achieving what you need them to achieve. And in those interim years, the recommendation would be that the Water Utility Advisory Committee participates and provides and reports back to the council with the status, with whether things are tracking as projected. One part of the recommendation there is also that it's a 5-year rate strategy. It's not as useful to have a 1-year snapshot. It's always more helpful to have sort of a rolling 5-year projection of what your operating results are going to be and whether your rates are keeping pace with your revenue requirements. So we would recommend a 5-year rate strategy. And also back to the comment about the sewer tap fees, it's our understanding that sewer tap fees have not been adjusted for many years here in the city, and our recommendation would be that you adopt a methodology that is creates a rational nexus, creates a connection between your sewer capital projects and the tap fee, and make sure it's a growth to the extent reasonable and practical growth pace for growth. With all this in mind, the approach that we took was a financial review. It was not meant to be a rate study, a replacement for a rate study, or even a capital financing analysis. It was a high-level review of the anticipated financial results of the water and sewer utility, and we took that information and ran it through several iterations, several scenarios with the help of the CAG and of staff. And what we ended up with is what you see here in this chart. Again, we got direction, as Pat pointed out, that we wanted to to minimize the impact to the typical ratepayer. If we could limit that to a 6% total increase in monthly bill, that was the target. So you can see that we've, in this chart, that is the increase that we've anticipated for the next 5 years. And with that,
one of the questions that we certainly received as we've gone through the program here is, how much of that increase would be due to what's kind of a pass-through cost? And what you see on that is, of those increases that were shown, water supply cost makes up about 65% of that increase. The remaining 35% goes to increased operating cost, as well as implementing the strategic plan itself on the water side. On the sewer side, it's about a 50-50 split on the sewer side itself. Some of the other questions that we had from certainly the CAG, or the Community Advisory Group, as we went through this, is what's happened in other communities. City of Lee Summit, or the water utility, hasn't had a rate increase since 2006. What you see from some of the neighbors, Kansas City's rates increased almost 50% during that time. City of Independence, almost 40% during that time. So while the Lee Summit Utility's done a great job of holding the rates down, and certainly that's the goal, is to keep rates as low as possible, others have been having increases. And then we were constantly asked, well, what's the comparison? Where does the City of Lee Summit sit versus other communities? And what we're showing you here is the cost of 5,000 gallon user just on the water rate itself, since that's if you looked at the 2012 impact on rates, it was on the water side. And what you see, if you look at the bars, the green bar near the left would be a typical what a 5,000 gallon residential user would pay in a year for their water service. You'll notice as you look across through the communities, it is obviously one of the lowest in the Kansas City area. If you were to implement that 2012 increase, you move over 2 bars or 3 bars. It's now that white bar, so we're now showing you where you would move to if you implemented that increase. And then the other question was, what does that look like on a combined water and sewer bill? So the bars are each broken down, blue being water contribution, the green portion being the sewer contribution. And again, on both these, the red line was kind of the average of all the bars there. And what you see again, Lee Summit, even on a combined water and sewer bill, you're one of the lower ones, and you in essence jump over 1 bar. The thing that I didn't point out on the last slide was the unique feature for Lee Summit is they buy their water from Kansas City and Independence. I'll just flip back up to that, and you'll notice that currently today residents of Lee Summit pay less for water than what the same user does in Independence. They jump past them with the increase, but either way still less than what a typical 5,000 gallon user would pay in the city of Kansas City. So certainly those are questions we answered for the CAG about the affordability. As we kind of wrap this presentation up, certainly tonight what's being asked is for the council to accept the strategic plan moving forward into the first quarter of next year. That 2012 water rate increase needs to be implemented. That's largely due to the cost of the water supply increases. That side of it needs to catch up. Reserves should not go as low as they in essence are going. Then the next pieces of the strategic plan would be to implement that Water Utilities Advisory Committee and commence the cost of service study. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Bill. He can add any other comments or perspectives that certainly the CAG has, and then we'll open it up to discussion for the group.
Pat, is that right? We're raising rates? Oh, no, I'm sorry. I think we all understand what the backlog is. It's very clear. I think the not raising rates for a number of years has contributed to that backlog. And as a consumer, as a customer, as a resident of this city, I think there are some things to like, even though rates have to go up. One of them is that it is structured, that we can plan for it. It's a measured rate of increase, and businesses can adjust for it, consumers can adjust for it. It also addresses really the main issue, which is our infrastructure. A lot of it is old, a lot of it is, I wouldn't say crumbling, but there's pieces of it that need to be maintained. They're going to cause more problems. Emergency repairs cost more than planned repairs. Cost, manpower and overtime. There's going to be main breaks which interrupt traffic that can affect other infrastructure. There is sewage backup that is a PR nightmare as well as a personal nightmare for those that are involved with it. So the infrastructure needs to be fixed, and a lot of the areas in our older communities, a lot of the central core here is feeling that pain the most or will feel it in the future. And we really think that group needs to be represented here. Overall, there's satisfaction levels and an ability to maintain more involvement like we have over the last year to year and a half that continue, so that's also a positive. And really, the water and sewage issues are not just a public health issue, but they're really a business and an economic issue as well. For all the reasons up above I mentioned that affect consumers, it also affects businesses. Businesses that want to expand here, businesses that want to grow or move into town, they're all going to look at our infrastructure, not just the above-ground infrastructure, but the underground infrastructure. And really, I'd say the foundation of Lee Summit going forward, it's not necessarily about the water. But if you're a business, you want to move into a community that addresses its problems, that's proactive, where business, where government, where the consumer can work together to solve its biggest problems. Not a community that pushes that off, that holds back. In the end, we all moved to Lee Summit. I don't think many of us moved here because the water was $3 cheaper or the sewer was $1 cheaper. We moved here because we believe in the community. We think it can grow. We think it can be an economic powerhouse going forward. But we need to invest in it. And we need to invest in this infrastructure. We need to address this problem today. And if we do, we'll have a brighter future tomorrow. Thank you.